Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our ReggieCon panel discussing Darkroom, Memoir in Black and White. We're thrilled tonight for you to join us during the celebration of Latinx Heritage Month. This is actually our third year of ReggieCon at Illinois State University, and it keeps getting better. So very exciting things happening. This is actually our first ReggieCon panel of the 22-23 year. And there are many, many more exciting panels to come. My name is actually Jana Albrecht, and I'm the Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management here at Illinois State. And before we begin the panel, sorry, I have a few housekeeping details that we have to shout out so we can run a little more smoothly through this. But first, this session will be recorded and it will be on the ReggieCon website. Second, if you need confirmation of attendance, I know some of you students are in that need that. We'll go ahead and put that in the panel closer to the end. Third, the presenters, their video and their audio will be on, but they can't hear you or see any of you as guests. But they love to get your questions. So we'll monitor the Q&A function. So we certainly encourage you to ask those questions often and frequently. And they may not, it's one of their favorite things to do. They may not get to your question right away, but they will get to it eventually throughout the session. So last update is you can on the ReggieCon website find previous recordings. They're great. I highly recommend that you go and take a look. And then the website will also keep you up to date on details for the sessions to eventually to come for 22-23. So, okay, enough of the housekeeping. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce our fearless leader, Dr. Scott Jordan, who also happens to be our moderator and our panelist for tonight's discussion. Dr. Jordan is also the chair of psychology here at Illinois State University. So Scott, go ahead and take it away, and ReggieCon crew, feel free to join him too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Albrecht. Everyone, welcome to season 3 of ReggieCon, the con that asks the question, what's your story? Where's Eric? Come on in, Eric. Okay, well, he'll come in. So I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist, philosopher here at Illinois State University. And tonight we come together to celebrate Latinx Heritage Month with a discussion of the amazing graphic novel, Darkroom, a memoir in black and white. Joining me on tonight's panel is that motley crew of comic and pop culture aficionados, purveyors of all things geekdom, the ReggieCon crew. First, the hardest working man in comics, Mr. Victor Dandridge Jr. Victor, please tell the audience a little something about who you are.
Hello, I am the first one that's late to the party. I'm telling on myself. I apologize for that. I literally had this down for tomorrow, so I was like, I got one more day.
Nobody knew. Nobody knew.
I gotta keep it honest with my people. But I'm a phenomenological narratologist, self-publishing comic creator from Columbus, Ohio. I self-publish through my imprint Bandage In-House Productions, and also teach people how to make their own comics through my You Create Comics line. And it's a pleasure to be back for the third year. 3 years. It's amazing.
Absolutely, man.
ReggieCon for life.
Gonna be a blast.
Absolutely.
Also joining the ReggieCon crew, we're thrilled to have her with us. The one, the only, Dr. Vanessa Hintz. Vanessa, please tell the audience a little something about who you are.
I will. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be elevated to a series regular in the ReggieCon crew. I'm so excited. I'm Dr. Vanessa Hintz, licensed clinical psychologist, currently located just west of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I, again, am a clinical psychologist. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional, a social justice warrior, a Black nerd, a lover of all things pop culture, and I love to talk about pop culture and its intersections with the world of DEI. So looking forward to our conversation tonight. Thank you all so much.
Oh, fantastic. So glad that you're here. And also on the Reggie crew, my colleague and partner in crime in all things nerdy, Dr. Eric Wesselman. Eric, please tell the audience a little something about who you are.
So I'm Eric Wesselman, a professor of psychology at Illinois State University. My primary area of research is on the dynamics of social inclusion and exclusion, but I also love to connect my research to popular culture, movies, TV shows, comics, and graphic novels. I also teach courses focused on the psychology and its interface with comics and graphic novels.
Fantastic. It's so good to hang out with all of you again. Looking forward to another amazing year. So now that the ReggieCon crew is in the house, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the suffering of those caught in the destructive path of Hurricane Fiona. Days before the 5-year anniversary of Hurricane Maria, killing thousands in Puerto Rico, Hurricane Fiona hit the island this week with more than 20 inches of rain, causing flash flooding, mudslides, and leaving the entire land without power. Our hearts go out to those who've been impacted by this disaster, and it's our hope the U.S. response will be swift and effective in alleviating their suffering. Now, before we introduce tonight's special guest, we have 2 pieces of business that we have to address. First, I'd like to acknowledge the people that make events like this possible. Dr. Amelia Noah Elkins, Dr. Jana Albrecht, Mr. Sean Thornton, who does all the amazing ReggieCon artwork for us, Miss Danny Schroeder, and Miss Summer Simmons. Without the 5 of you, we would just be talking to ourselves. So thank you so much for everything that you do. And next, a few weeks ago during Festival ISU, I had the pleasure of sitting out on the quad at a desk, talking to students about ReggieCon, asking them to fill out little slips of paper containing their contact information, and then dropping them into a bucket so we could do a drawing so that they would have the possibility of winning this amazing bag of ReggieCon swag. So I'm here now to announce the winners of our drawing: Ruthie Lamb, Prince Kessie, and Laurencia Mensa. Again, that's Ruthie Lamb, Prince Kessie, and Laurencia Mensa. We will make sure to contact you given we have your email address, and we truly hope to see you sporting the swag on the quad, telling everybody what a fantastic thing ReggieCon is. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce tonight's guest panelists. Coming to ReggieCon from the Department of English here at Illinois State University, Mr. Edsel J. Citron Gonzalez. Edsel, please enter the room and tell us a little something about why you love comics.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to this space. I love comics a lot, especially how multifaceted they are in terms of narration, how amazing the illustrations are, and how different authors tell their lived experiences through a different kind of storytelling. So I think that's why I draw and connect a lot with comics and graphic novels as a genre.
Fantastic. Edsel, we're thrilled to have you with us and looking forward to hearing what you have to say about Darkroom. And now, tonight's special guest, author, illustrator of tonight's topic of discussion, Darkroom, a memoir in black and white, Miss Leela Quintero Weaver. Leela, please come into the ReggieCon room, say a little something about who you are, and then tell us the tale of how this fantastic piece of work came to be.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for hosting this event and for including me in it and for highlighting my book. It's just amazing. It's a wonderful honor. Thank you so much. So I think if I heard you correctly, you were interested in knowing how the book came to be?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I can tell you it's probably very few comic books that have begun this way. If my book could be called a comic book, let's call it a graphic novel instead. But it started as an academic project. I had kind of a big assignment that I created a 40-page illustrated just tiny memoir, a mini graphic novel. And it was about my family's immigration experience and some of the key events that happened in our small hometown that I guess we'll get into tonight after we had immigrated to the US and landed in Alabama. So I had this 40-page book that the director of the project urged me to go and show to certain people at my university. And then that led to being introduced to editors at the university press where I was. And that led to an offer for a publication contract. So
it's
pretty
fantastic.
crazy. I never expected anything like that. So
well, you got to do the work first before it has a chance for someone else to read it. So well done for doing the work, right? And we're So thrilled to have you here today. So here's how we do this thing on ReggieCon. I've asked each of the panelists to pick their favorite frame, page, whatever, from the graphic novel. And I'm going to display that, and they'll tell you why it's their favorite. And then the rest of us will talk about it for a bit, and then we'll see how far we get before we need to start taking audience questions. So, Victor, you're first up. So here is Victor's chosen panel or page.
So let me first start off by saying how difficult it was to pick a page, panel,
absolutely.
anything, because so much of this was just like a very refreshing sense of storytelling, which was absolutely amazing. It was phenomenal. One of the things that I really liked about the entire setup of this, and I have to give these roses, is that by design, it's almost built to be read as a webcomic, where it's sparse but very like vertically linear in the narration setup. So you can just kind of like scroll upward. So it was like something really built to be read in a certain format, and to read it as a regular book didn't feel like a challenge, but you could see how it would be very versatile in the way that it could be showcased, which I thought was amazing. I literally love that. But I picked this page because it rang so very interesting to me, because there's this conversation that we have now, ethnically speaking, that when it comes to Black and brown, that there's this unified sense of racism that is portrayed and affected against Black and brown people. And I would clearly say anyone of Hispanic descent would qualify as brown, or I would have said so before. But this page really kind of showcased that there was a time period where there was almost an assumed whiteness of a person, that if they were fair skinned, if they were of Hispanic, background, it didn't quite register that they were a person of color. And here you have these people in the most authentic, thank you for being so authentic, with the dialogue, with the vernacular, because you heard, like, if you've ever traveled to the South in America and you've heard this word "niggas," you heard it in a certain tone that was refreshing to read. Like, you could have picked anything, you could have jazzed it up, you could have played it down. You went very authentic, and I thought that was such a great piece to showcase this very real sense of racial injustice, spite, ire, but being relayed to a person of color that was not subject to it. And that was something I thought was such a beautiful sort of like just an illustration of the fine line between that racial divide of the time, where if you were light enough, you were white enough and it was fine. But if you weren't, oh, well, there's all kinds of trouble that could come about, especially even in the sense of this being a religious place that was supposed to be, in a sense of tolerance, everyone coming together. They're coming together to celebrate one unified religious voice. And because of their racial difference, they're shunned. Wow. Like, what a profound, like, in one page, what a profound moment of historic showcase of how deep racial tensions, racial ignorance, racial prejudice can be in one page. Absolutely brilliant.
I gotta say, Victor, there's a theme in this, and the way that this page is illustrated, that permeates the book. And I won't swear to this, but you'll notice the frame where people are basically drawn with lines versus the frame below it, or the panel below it, where flesh tones are fleshed out and it usually the lines have to do with people speaking two-dimensionally. So it seems as if when people are speaking in simple two-dimensional ways, or one-dimensional ways, however we want to talk about it, that's the type of drawing they get. And then when we're looking at suffering, for example, we see it drawn much more extravagantly. And I thought that was a stunning way to visually amplify the text in a story.
Of course. Well, even going super metatextually, the idea that the fully rendered individuals were ones that are only viewed from this flat lens, but there's so much more to them. And that's the metatextual truth, is they were only being judged by the color of their skin. They were literally coming to uplift the same, religious voice, potentially with a lyrical musical styling flavor that would have just blown the doors off of the church, but weren't allowed to be, given that opportunity just based off of this flat, quick visual. Oh no, the Negras. Oh, we can't have that. Like there was something so beautiful about that authenticity. And then you almost look at it and go, well, y'all the ones that missed out. Y'all don't even know the church y'all was about to have. Y'all could have paid for a whole new roof, whole new building fund if y'all had let them sing. Y'all messed up.
Exactly. Vanessa, Eric, Etzel, comments?
If I may. Whew. Okay, so we going from the jump.
Come on, that's how we do it. That's how we do it. That's how we do it.
So one thing I'll say, and it's interesting because I read that frame in a voice, and it was so authentic to me that it was almost vicariously traumatic. Like reading the book, there was like a vicarious trauma, which is no one's fault. It's just the authenticity was so real related to the anti-Black racism that I was sitting on the couch reading it, and I kept going, whoo, and my husband was like, what are you doing over there? Like, are you okay? And I was like, this is deep, like this, and it was intense. And I think interestingly for me, it was, again, that authenticity was simultaneously comforting, like somebody gets it, and like a stab in the heart, because I think any of those frames could have been from 2022. You know what I'm saying? And so I was like, the accuracy, you know what I'm saying? And so I appreciate that authenticity as well. And I think as we get into talking about this more, the dynamics that you spoke of around the dichotomous racism, Black-white racism, and how that was sort of, you highlighted that throughout. Leela, thank you so much. You highlighted that throughout. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Wow, thank you.
All right, then. Well, on that note, I think we'll go ahead and we'll go on to Vanessa's chosen page.
Okay, great. Okay, so I too, like Victor, by the time I got to reading this, I had about 42 screenshots, and I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to pick just one? There was so many. And so what I decided on was this frame, and I think it's because this page spoke to me personally. I identify as a Black woman. I'm a biracial Black woman. And throughout my life, I felt like I've had to straddle two worlds. And if there was ever a perfect description, visual description of that, it is this. The way that you are sort of trying to find your way and walking in these two worlds. And I think, through your story, you sort of talked about the way that you did that. This spoke to me so much. And I think the weight that you see on the back there, and I think there was something before this in terms of like with the I think it was a horse that yes. Sort of that it was too much. I'm not getting emotional. This is, to me, I don't know how to explain to someone what it's like to try to not be enough in either of those worlds, right? To not be Black enough, to not be white enough, to try to find your way. And I think that that's part of, just from my personal experience, that was part of my development, figuring out how to sort of live in this chasm without falling. But I think that is a battle that I fight constantly. And I think for a lot of people that may be straddling two different cultures, two different worlds in some way, shape, or form, we're constantly trying to find that balance and what that balance looks like in the moment. And I think that sometimes, and many a times, when we feel like that is difficult, it feels exactly like this picture looks, that there's so much weight and that one wrong move, and we're falling into the infinite abyss of not knowing or understanding who we are. So this, it really touched me. It really touched me for a number of different reasons. So thank you. Thank you again. I'm gonna say that 10,000 times today. Thank you so much for this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Comments?
Yeah, I gotta riff on this one, because as a storyteller, this was probably one of the most advanced pieces of storytelling that I saw throughout this whole book. And it was a struggle not to pick this one. So Vanessa, I'm glad that you did. Because the foreshadowing of the mule that got its back broken, the context of what is actually being said here is that this is now the risk of you as this character, that your back will be broken trying to carry the weight of these two worlds. And without even having to say that that's the risk, because you told that bit of the story earlier, the foreshadowing involved, it's such a clear showcase. The substitution is on point where it is the true essence of metaphor. You don't even have to explain it. You did that already, and just a wily reader will read and go, yep, I get exactly what you mean. Like Vanessa said, it was borderline traumatic to just kind of, drag that out, because the things that you're saying without actually saying it says everything. Like that's a sermon right there. Like that is what that is. It's a parable, and it's well done. Very, very well done.
Thank you. Wow.
Yeah,
Can
Vanessa,
I jump in for a second?
Please, of course you can. Please do.
So I'm sure you've heard this before since you've talked to other authors, that there's nothing so gratifying as your readers getting what you're going for. I mean, I feel it. I physically feel those words that Vanessa and Victor spoke, to just how they connected. And so I do want to just say one little thing about the background of this image that we're looking at right now, that when I was working on it, I thought, how can I portray this dilemma that I was feeling as a child, and that I felt such a weight to try to have to straddle these two worlds. And I couldn't think of anything, and I was on a walk. And while I was on the walk, not thinking about the book, not struggling with it, that suddenly it just came to me. The pack of the horse in my father's cavalry unit that the officer shot because it was overburdened. And it just suddenly just clink, and just everything came together, which is, I mean, that's how creativity works a lot of times, is that when you are letting go a little bit, when you're not thinking about it, that suddenly the answer comes. So just wanted to share that.
No, I love what you just said. I mean, I suspect most creators, when they're in a space we'd call stuck, find a way to get unstuck, and it's usually not by doing the same thing. Go for a walk, as you said. I like to just think of it as putting my brain in a different state that's not that, and then I'm a little more open. I did want to follow up, Vanessa. I actually thought about you in more than one way when I saw this image, because this girl goes through the stages you often discuss, or the different phases or types of identity experience in this novel. So I'll just, if you would, for a minute or so, please sort of tell the audience what I'm talking about and how it relates to this image.
Absolutely. So there are a number of different sort of models of racial identity development, and one developed by a well-renowned psychologist, Dr. Darrell Sue, and his colleagues, related to, I don't like this language, but ethnic minorities, people of color, how we come into our own sort of racial identity. And the way that starts is sort of, particularly, and I think that this is a unique situation because these models typically are, there are different variables to consider when people have immigrated. But I will say, just generally speaking, we see like initially people sort of ascribe to dominant cultural values. So whatever that looks like in your space. For many of us in America, dominant cultural values are white values. So we kind of just go with the flow. We see what we see. We emulate what we see. Like, white is right. Cool. Let's go. Let's do it. Ultimately, something happens in our lives for people of color where we're confronted with the fact that we are not white, and we are not going to be treated as white people. And so I think that the panel that Victor showed, where your dad was sort of confronted with those people like, yo, what are you doing? That would be what we call a race-related event that pushes people into this space of dissonance, where they're kind of like now confused. Like, I thought I understood what I value. This thing happened, and now I don't know. Now I'm just unsure, right? People tend to move from that state into what we call resistance and immersion. which is essentially you only want to be surrounded with people who look like you. Everyone else can go jump off a cliff. You don't really care. You only really trust or believe in people who look like you because they understand you. You feel really secure in that identity. You feel mad at your old self for being brainwashed, right? And then ultimately what happens? We get into another space of dissonance because we realize that the world is not as discrete as that. It's not as either or. All white people aren't terrible, right? We don't have to throw all the white people away. Like some of them are cool, right? And so then ultimately people get into this space of what we call integrative awareness, where you experience that, you think about that teetering on that, in that balance, you find a way to stay balanced, and whatever that looks like for you. So you can ascribe to dominant values, you can ascribe to your sort of cultural values related to your racial identity. And ultimately, I would say those things don't happen linearly, like they just happen when they happen. But one thing I would say is when we think about racial identity, particularly for people who are bicultural, or again, people of color in America, it's about finding the balance that works for you, whatever that looks like. And I think that, again, that image, that was that whole journey in one picture.
Exactly.
Right there.
And what was interesting is that while she was in the early part of the story, sort of adopting white culture, it came down to actually wanting her parents not to be around. Right. And the way you wrote that was rather heartbreaking, at the same time authentic, right? Oh, mom and dad, please don't speak Spanish now. Right. I mean, that's heartbreaking. And so I very much thought about the theories that you talk about, Vanessa, when we're in these kinds of spaces. So thank you very much.
Can we talk about how in so many different ways that there's been almost a cultural degrade in terms of the allowance of such a thing? You were asking for your parents not to do it so that you didn't stand out, but now we're literally seeing people not just criticized, but borderline attacked for speaking their native tongue in this America that we live in today. And you were doing it as a way of like, okay, let's assimilate. Let's just kind of, keep that back here. Like I'll do it at home. I'll absolutely, concede to the language of my home space. But when we leave this, we gotta assimilate. We gotta be in this world, where everyone knows that we're safe, we're okay, we're one of them. How crazy is it that we are literally seeing people today respond with such literal vitriol and violence to people that are choosing to expand their home space to wherever they are to feel that sense of comfort, and people are responding, no, you're not allowed to do that. You are not allowed to do that. You did it as a borderline like safety protocol, and you can see how those that have this negative intent will warp what you intended as a safety protocol as their entitlement protocol. And it's so very different. This book is deep. I'm literally mad at only just now finding out about this book. Like, I'm not even gonna
on that note, I think we're going to go ahead and go to Etzel's image. Hold on here, because it speaks to some of the issues we just discussed.
Yeah. And again, going on with what Victor said and Vanessa said, in the previous image, it really made me think too about with language itself, how I felt like I had to divide that sort of identity and part of me many times, like switching between English and Spanish, which is why this image spoke to me a lot in terms of like how much I realize now as an adult, how much I was assimilated as a child and basically valued English, valued American culture a lot when I was younger. And what I like about this image too, is that it basically reminded me of like my childhood, like basically the importance I would put on American media, American TV shows in order for me to grasp the language as fast as possible. The importance that my family, people around me said that, more opportunities if you learn English, more opportunities for you to leave the island eventually and make progress for yourself. And realizing how damaging that is too, in terms of like my Latino identity, more specifically my identity too as an islander, as part of the Caribbean, and what that entails as well. And I also found it a little bit funny that it says Kool-Aid with vitamin C, and I was like, haha, is it really? And basically like how now as an adult, it's like, no, I don't want to know anything about Kool-Aid. But it's really interesting, like how when I was young, I was basically like so into the different media and forms of communication, and that matters. So, and I also, speaking about the graphic novel itself, I really like the snapshots and basically the imagery of like basically seeing everything as like a glimpse and an image of film. And I thought that was like so beautifully illustrated, so beautifully written as well. And gosh, there's a lot I can talk about this graphic novel, and I'm just amazed with how much I've identified with this.
Someone want to follow up on Edsel's comments?
One thing that you said that stuck out to me was earlier, I think it was earlier before this, where you were talking about looking different than the girls or the women in the magazines. And it's interesting because when I think about, you talked about seeing like American media, and I'm like, whose America is that? You know what I'm saying? Because that ain't my America. And it's even interesting how, again, you think about those dominant cultural values and those dominant sort of ideals and understandings. It's interesting because for me, even seeing those images, that's foreign to me, right? And so I think that it was so jarring, and so to hear you talk about that as well in terms of people who immigrate to America, the image that they have of it versus me, I'm like, America is so raggedy. You know what I'm saying? Like sometimes I just think about it like, what are they showing like on 902? Well, whose life is that? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Again, I think it's purposeful. That is what's sort of what is like the dominant ideal about America. I think I too, though, interestingly, when I saw that Kool-Aid packet, there was an instant gratification, a comfort. I felt so happy. I too was wondering whose vitamin C is that? Like, I don't know what Kool-Aid that is. But interestingly, again, that sort of again, thinking about how we then there's automatically a comparison of us versus that thing. And then even for me too, and even for people who are sort of native to America but don't live that life, right? There's this same comparison thing that happens, I think, like a parallel process almost. So that's interesting to me based on, what you said.
So I got to give you mad love for this one in your context of the balance between speaking your native Spanish versus learning English. And it's so very interesting how the correlation between what we would call our vernacular speech at home versus speaking well, which is something that I get, from time to time. Oh, you speak so well. Okay, that's a racist microaggression. Thank you, appreciate it. But it's one of those things where that is an active choice. I actively choose to speak this way. And I understand that by doing so, it does open up opportunities for me, much in the same way that learning English as a whole does that. And it's so beautiful to see how culturally we have so many similarities. And that's the thing that projects like this kind of showcase. It's not about our differences. It is the ways that we are all simply related by the experience of living, like just that simple. Brilliant.
It's a lot of, I think,
go ahead.
Variations on the theme, that it's about being the outsider in different ways. That comes in different ways. And as Edsel was talking about leaving the island and the culture of Puerto Rico, that I haven't really seen a lot of graphic memoir or graphic novel set in the culture of Puerto Rico, which I would love to see that, because I would love to see it highlighted. The fact that a lot of continental U.S. residents don't even realize that Puerto Rico is part of the U.S. That when Puerto Ricans come to the mainland, they're not immigrating. It is not an immigration, that it is be a migration, that there is a change of culture, change of language. But anyway, it's a whole different ball game, but part of, I don't know, just like a subspecies of what we're talking about, being outsiders and being onlookers, all that.
That's fantastic. Eric, you looked like you wanted to say something.
Oh, I wanted to sort of riff off of what both Vanessa and Victor were saying about the issues of like sort of media depiction and which sort of cultural expressions are valued, right, or sort of centered. And I was reminded of moments that you had at the beginning of the book and at the end where you were sort of reflecting upon learning to draw, and you're talking about the sort of ideal face and the ideal body, and how life doesn't reflect quote unquote those ideals. And at the beginning it was focused, from what I recall, mostly on sort of body shape. And then towards the end, then you brought in the idea of sort of race and other types of considerations into it as well. So I just thought this sort of nice bookends to this idea of questioning what is considered to be the ideal, and how that we often, you know, it's very myopic.
Well, on that note, why don't we just go ahead and go to your frame, Eric? It contains photos.
Well, like the other panelists, I had difficulty choosing what I wanted to talk about here. And I'm also interested in the creator's commentary. So I'll just talk about what I resonated with this page. You know, first off, comparing it in terms of structure to some of the other pages, this was sort of the first page I remember having these sort of quote unquote standard 3x3 grid that we often see in, you know, a lot of comics. And here, of course, as opposed to just having, you know, panels with gutters, we have photos, which is a big theme in this book, which I appreciated. And as I was looking at it, you know, I noticed that the two middle pictures on the second and third row were bigger than all the rest. And so I started asking myself, okay, that's a choice. So why do I think the creator made those choices? And sort of reflecting afterwards, I interpret it as these being sort of the two out of all the events, which were already being key in the father's life, which two events I saw as themes that were relevant to the author's overall narrative. So the father teaching himself to read, this idea of self-education, the importance of education sort of cuts through the book, or at least that's what I noticed as an educator. Particularly, I resonated later on with the discussion that you had about what is taught, how it's taught, and what isn't taught, which is a big discussion, certainly in this country right now. And then the sort of second larger image, the decision to immigrate to America, I was then struck by towards the end of the book when reflecting upon your past, how you thought, well, how would life have been different had my father not made this decision? So for me, that's how I came to the idea why I think these two pictures are bigger. And of course, you can tell me how close I am or not. So,
well, I absolutely love your interpretation, and that wasn't intentional. So I'll just say that. So a lot of times choices that I made like that were based on design choices that I wanted to make sure that it didn't look like neat little boxes. I wanted more of an organic feel, because the idea sort of behind a lot of the page designs was to have a sort of family photo album / scrapbook. And so the fact, you know, I made these, I tried to give them a dimension, make shadows so that it looks like they're lying on a surface, the actual photos. But I think your interpretation is brilliant, and I'm going to adopt that. I'm going to claim that was my intention.
There you go. There you go. Anyone want to comment on that?
I definitely love the 9-panel grid structure that's inherent to that. It does key into very brilliant, prominent works like Watchmen that, you know, are seminal works in our medium. And so for you to do so and even play with the idea of implied borders, where yes, the actual photos themselves create a border, but you know that the panel is not over until you've actually read the text along with it. So you're using this very like extensive, intense, advanced form of comic book storytelling with this story. It's like, what other books do you do? Because this is like, this can't be the first one, because this is that high level of what you're doing, the tools that you're playing with. This is super advanced style of storytelling, and it's absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Wow.
You know what, I thank you, Eric, for pointing out the two pictures being larger, because both of those look to me like travel, cognitive travel, body travel. And I can't speak for anyone but myself, but reading books saved my life, transformed my life, turned me on to lifestyles that I weren't in my life, turned me on to values that weren't in my life when I was a teenager, and made me crave something different. And I have traveled as well. And it's the kind of, in a sense, cognitive travel, body travel. It's putting yourself in a different space. Because I do think there are those who, for whatever reason, whoever they are, crave the tensions they have in their identity. They're not interested in necessarily being whole and done with the work. And reading and travel are ways to disrupt yourself, right? And so I very much appreciate that interpretation, because those are just self-disruptions. You're reading a book or traveling to another land. Absolutely.
And if I may just what's something you said, Scott, triggered something in me in thinking about travel and thinking about the book, as you mentioned, as a scrapbook, that just clicked for me, that I felt like I was almost like reading someone's diary, like it was almost voyeuristic. I was like, ooh, I'm like way into this, but something that you said, Scott, triggered in me that this was the first time, because, as an African-American, as a Black person in America, the racism that you were talking about was not new to me in the beginning. Thinking about like the marches about voting rights, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is very familiar to me. And still, I have never engaged with that history from the perspective of someone who was not Black or was not white. You know what I'm saying? And so there was something about that travel, that journey, that had me engulfed, because typically I like to steer away from racial trauma narratives because it just is too much for me. That's my job every day to think about that. I don't want to do that outside of office hours. This was something different that I think it kind of snuck up on me, that this was almost a retelling of a story from a different perspective, and one that I have not, before reading this, had to ever confront. Because I think about, the Jim Crow era South, or, like that time in the South, I think about Black people and I think about racist white people and no one else, because again, that's been my experience and been the way that I view that history. So something you said, Scott, like I feel like that was a journey for me to gain a different perspective about something that I felt like I knew a lot about, right? I still think I know a lot about it, but you know what I'm saying? Not in that way. So again, all the flowers. And thank you so much for me, again, as a Black person in America, being able to, see that perspective was, thank you. Thank you.
That's awesome. So we have one image left to discuss, and it's mine. And before I show it to you, my colleagues have talked about their difficulty picking a favorite. You can see all these different pieces of paper I had in mind, going back and figuring out which one am I going to choose. So I picked the one that let me talk about the most of the book. And that is this 3-page spread about the history. And this 3-page spread is terribly important to me personally. As the father of biracial daughters, it's important to me to understand how to talk to them about living in this country. And one way is to begin at a certain time. Another way is to begin at an earlier time. And another way is to begin at an increasingly earlier time. And I'm one that argues that as we get further away, sometimes we're guilty of ignoring the suffering of those who were closer to us in time. And at the same time, this sort of global perspective on the species is something I appreciate very much. When you take a 23andMe genetic test, they'll often tell you how many thousands of years ago your genes were in certain geographic locations, right? So what we see is a massive planetary migration, all of which, at least to the current science, stems from Africa, right? So we see certain genes parking in Northern Europe, not going much further because of the mountains for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, altering what those people look like, right? And we can see from that historical perspective, a sort of planetary togetherness that I'm not going to say solves anything, but what I can say is, particularly in talking to my daughters, talking to them about being an historic planetary citizen gives us a space to talk about trauma, about their identities now, that I think just gives us what I'll call degrees of freedom, just more angles to look at. It connects us to stories of oppression in other countries, right? And as you guys were saying, the outsiders in a different context. And then what I just love about this, I've talked about it earlier, but in that middle panel there, you've got these beautifully well-defined faces. All the details are there, things that people don't often see, as you've mentioned. And then you get the next page, which is people drawn in stick figures, right? And they're drawn in stick figures because they can't see what's in the middle. And I just love the fact that you don't say, oh, by the way, in this middle page, they're drawn this way for a reason. And then in this page, they're drawn this way for a different reason. So I love the juxtaposition of the larger historical planetary context, and then coming up real close again to actually real people in a time of now, and then drawing them in a complex way or a very simple way. I just love the work that's contained in those 3 pages.
That's very well said. Very, very well said. The commentary of those people and their flatness of understanding is Argentina. Well, that's South Alabama. I know where that's at. You're like, baby. And if I can say it, like, reading this book, it pointed out my own personal blind spot to geography, and how perhaps as a sign of culture, I could show you on a map, unannotated, where England is, where France is, where Spain is, where Germany is. But you show me Central and South America, and I could not point out where each location is, because we're not taught that way. For whatever reason, we are neglected in terms of the continental space that is literally connected to us, but we're taught more about the lands overseas where others came from versus a place that we could theoretically walk to. Granted, it would take a while, but we could do that because it's physically connected to the space we're in right now, and we don't learn about that. And that was something that this book showcased. The one of the other pieces that I had was the stake and the different countries aligned, and I was like, I couldn't have told you that. I couldn't have told you that as a grown-up. I couldn't have done that. And I was like, and that's ridiculous. This is in my hemisphere. This is my continental cousin here. And I couldn't tell you exactly what's there south of Mexico. That's all I got. And I'm like, that's a fallacy. That's a shame, and indicative of so many aspects of what this book covers, by the hidden secrets of this racial oppression, of not talking about culture, not talking about other people, only talking about a certain group's sense of self and how that's supposed to reflect on everybody else. Brilliant.
And I think that's because, and again, something that was addressed in the book, the colonizers make the history books.
Yeah.
And so, because when that excerpt from the Alabama history, oh gosh, I was just like, what? And again, the book's probably still being used today. And so I think that to your point, when we talk about systemic oppression, I think that people don't always grasp what that means. And it means exactly what you just described. It means everything that's talked about in this book, right? Like, it starts from the beginning, you know what I'm saying? It doesn't just happen. These are things that are permeating every aspect of our society. The education system, every child in America is required by law to attend school. And so this is what they learning up in school. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that why is European history required, but everything else is an elective? You know what I'm saying? Because the colonizers make the history. And so I think that again, what was so subtly beautiful about this was the depiction of all of those many tentacles of systemic oppression based on lived experience, based on all of these different things.
And the psychology of that pedagogy is never neutral, right? It's never, okay, these are just the facts of how history played out. There's clearly persuasion going on. And the persuasion is often set up to make the author feel good, right? So ironically, they're teaching people implicitly who to like and not like, and they're wrapping all of the adult emotion into how that's presented, and the kids pick it up. And they don't know that they're being trained what to value and not to value. These are their parents. These are their teachers. These are their caregivers. They just love what they love. You know, I mean, not all of them, but you know what I'm saying. So it's the insidiousness is at every level. It's at the text itself. It's at the way it's presented. Yeah, it's at the publishers. It's everywhere. So I appreciate that take on systemic, because it's not just one place. It's every level of the place. Right.
And I think value is the operative word that you use there, because at the root of all discriminatory practices and stereotypical behavior is a lack of value. I can treat you this way, I can talk to you this way, I can do this because you have less value. And again, who do we see on TV? Who do we see in the book? Those people celebrities have value to us, right? Like, oh, they're everywhere, whatever. You know what I'm saying? We are, like you said, we're taught what to value. And I think that in moving forward, when we think about what we do in this world to try to be more inclusive and be more harmonious, it is teaching people how to value difference, to not ignore it because it's there. We're not gonna treat everybody the same, because no, we're gonna value different. You know what I'm saying? And I think that those things, again, are so subtly and insidiously taught that thinking of doing anything other is blasphemous enough for people to yell in school board meetings, right? It's black.
Yes.
What are you talking about? You know what I'm saying? And it's
Yeah.
That's why this needs to be required reading in all schools. I'm just saying.
It's also training your own kids to ask themselves the question when they're being sold a bill of goods: what's going to stay the same in the world if I believe this? Right? What's going to stay the same? And then that lets you know what the author's after, right? So they're never going to talk this way as if somehow they made a choice and there's a thing they want. They're always going to talk this way as if it's the way it's supposed to be. And they're just giving you the facts. And yes, that's my dog, but I'm not going to leave. Someone will take care of him in a moment. But so teaching readers to ask themselves what's going to stay the same if I believe this is not cynical. It just lets you get a different take on what you're being told.
And for me, actually, where I find myself resonating with what you said, Scott, comes back to earlier, that image of the father educating himself, and later on the author choosing the books to read from the older sister. I mean, it's just these things, how do they change when, you know, especially if one is going to public school or private school, but any sort of type of system that's created where the books are chosen, right? It's extra work on the part of the individual to sort of seek these things out. And I think about this because my children are homeschooled, and so, you know, my spouse and I, when trying to build curricula, there are very few curricula out there that fit the values that we would like to witness to our children, right? And so trying to fit, we have to sort of go out and find different documents, different books of different types, right? Graphic memoirs like this, to sort of try and flesh out the areas in our own education that we didn't get, right? And so there's, I found myself really coming back to that point a lot about, that was, like, it was the second page that I chose, which I didn't mark in my current book right now, but it was I think, once again, this idea of, you had different images of information being communicated, and I think the larger question was, what do, you know, it was, I think you were thinking about the top image was the school, and then the second image was your parents, and the third image was your older sister. And it was all talking about what was going on around you. And that is like at every level, it was like you were not getting the full story of what was going on. Mm. So I think, yeah, that was the second thing that really stuck with me, because I'm like, all right, well, if I've got children between ages of 11 and 2, so I would love to show parts of this book, but other parts I'm like, should I wait a couple of years? I don't know. I mean, this is sort of what that's what I'm perseverating on.
You know, one of the things we can do as disruptors in the world of contemporary media, first of all, let's just say there's a lot of fantastic disruptive media going on these days, this book being an example. Yet when I was raising my kids and we were in the presence of the stuff, we used it as a teaching tool. We talked with them about what they were being sold, you know, and if you believe this are the consequences of carrying yourself this way in your life. So, you know, parents can be disruptors as well. And hell, friends can be disruptors, colleagues can be disruptors. The self can be a disruptor. So, you know, absolutely. So please do go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say research actually supports that in terms of how, you know, the cultivating a resilience and what we call positive racial socialization can mitigate the negative effects of racism. It doesn't go away, obviously. That's like a whole other situation. But thinking about to your question, Eric, about, you know, what do we do? I think that interestingly for people of color, it's like, well, we gotta do something, you know what I'm saying? Because again, the world is the way that it is. And so I think that what you're describing about your children and what you're describing too, Scott, is an example of allyship, because you can choose not to have those conversations with your kids.
Yep,
I
exactly.
think, you know, people of color can choose to also. It's a bit different in terms of what the outcomes are. And I think that, you know, that's what allyship is. It is teaching your kids or understanding that from your situation and in your space, you have privilege because of X, Y, and Z. This is what we're going to do with that. You know what I'm saying? And I think that in the book, we see that with your dad in terms of like what he is doing and being someone that can be passing, quote unquote, and what he's doing with the privilege that he has because of education and because of all these different things and what he elected to do with that, because he very well could have just blended in and been like, oh, we don't like Black people. Okay, I'm going to do that too, because that's what everybody else around here is doing. And that wasn't it. And I know there were a lot of people who did do that. And so I think that and I think about how today we have so much information that's floating out around there about resilience, about positive racial socialization, and what those things can do to benefit the next generation of children, and how, you know, in the time in which you wrote this story, that information wasn't as prevalent, I'm assuming. And so how people just had to sort of figure that out, right? And I think that I'm very thankful that, you know, your dad did what he did, and we're here talking about this book right now. But again, I think that there is power in what we can do in terms of what you're describing, Scott, disrupting. And I also think it is necessary if we want to change anything about this world that we live in.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I mean, I do, but I know we got to get to some questions.
Well, Jana, do we have any questions?
We don't have any questions yet, but I put in the chat that they could feel free to ask whenever. Oh, wait, we have one.
Okay. I don't see it, Jenna.
Sure. It's for Leela. Can you speak about the illustrations, how long they take? Are they all pencil? Are some digital?
Okay, so they are basically pencil enhanced with ink. And the only digital work that I did was to do some design components. For example, a lot of layering of images that I would sometimes use one image as a background and then take another image and digitally cut it out as a silhouette and then superimpose them. So all the drawings are done on paper with pencil and ink. A little bit of paint for some of those night scenes because I needed a lot of darkness. I couldn't really cover with just an ink pen. So the digital part, I was brand new at that. I had to learn all of that from scratch. And so that was limited. I didn't really have enough time. It took me a full year to do the final artwork. And before that came a couple of roughly illustrated drafts. Some individual drawings, some of them were very quick because some of them are really small. And then there's at least 1 2-page spread that comes in chapter 8, which is the chapter where I address the things that happened one particular night in 1965 in my hometown. And there's a night scene that shows I wanted to depict an intersection, a city intersection at night with a couple of hundred people standing and waiting for something to happen. I had to piece that together. I had no single reference source for that. So that took me about a week to do that one drawing. So there was huge range. And all that. I listened to a ton of podcasts and audiobooks while I drew.
That's awesome. Can you tell us when framing the book in the idea of you and your dad in a dark room, right? When did that come to the work? Was it at the beginning and you grounded everything in that, or was there a eureka moment and boom, no, this is about coming to be, and the coming to be that happens in a dark room?
So I think that's the answer to that is a little bit similar to the earlier story I told you, the creative moment where I didn't have an idea about how to depict that one concept. And that's because the work that came, the academic project that came before the book, I was trying to figure out how am I going to put together a small book with illustrations. So what I did, and I have it right here with me, is I thought, I think I'll use a photo album. So the photo album just naturally led to this idea of why don't I make it look like the interior of a family photo album, because I'm telling a family story. And hey, my father did photography. And hey, I love to be in the dark room with him. So this is just like a chain of things that just one idea leads to something else, So when it came time to sort of put together a book-length manuscript, I thought this would be a unifying motif, and also would touch on another secondary aspect of photography, which is the photography of the civil rights era, which turned out to be, as I did research, I had no idea, but it turned out to be that this was a key component to the strategy that a lot of the organizers put together, which was we need the world to see what is going on in these small towns with these sheriffs who are bullies, who are really doing oppressive things, and we need cameras there. So the role of the photojournalist in the civil rights movement was really huge impact. You can kind of see a corollary with the Vietnam conflict that we had before the war in Vietnam, that most wars were not on live television, right? You didn't see images, and that images really make a huge impact. So all of that came together for me.
I'll say one more thing in it quickly, and then I'll move on, because my dad had a dark room in our basement, and I did develop negatives in the different solutions, develop pictures. And the minute your characters are in a dark room, I knew this was a story about becoming, right? And the time and the findings. So it's beautifully done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question. So we've been talking about a lot of different layers to this book. And earlier, I might have been in the pre-show, we talked about how this book has been adopted as a text in a variety of different disciplines. If there was one take-home message you wanted readers to take from this book, just one, what would that be?
Wow. Well, I think I saw it in some of your promotional material, that little tag that said, "What's your story?" So I'm an everyday person. I'm no one knows me, you know, and until I published this book, no one outside of my tiny circle knew me. And it's this idea that inside every human being is packaged a whole life full of stories and of points of view and of the things that they have seen and witnessed. All of those, you spoke of layers in the book, layers in each individual, and what we bring and the stories that are resident in us and that maybe we just haven't let them unfold in a way that we can share them with the world. So my language is the language of art and words. Other people have a different way to express this. So I think that's, maybe I would say that. What's your story? Yes.
What's your story? Anyone else question? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Vanessa.
I was just going to say from a sort of psychological perspective or it's like an identity perspective, I think that is what identity is. I think is figuring out how your story, how all of those layers show up for you, or how does that indicate, you know, what you value, your worldview. Like we talk about worldview all the time, and that's one thing that I loved about this story is that from me as a psychologist, as a person who works in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as I was reading, I'm like, you know, thinking about how these events could have, and I think some of what you talked about how this influenced your being, your lived experience. And that's one thing that I value so much about this work is that so often when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're talking about valuing, we're talking about all these social justice, it's very abstract, and people are going, they throw out these words and they're like, we're gonna do this, and it's like, what does that mean? What does that mean in lived life? And I think that lived life is about stories, and it's about storytelling. And so that's one thing that, thinking about using this as a tool, right? I think about in the spaces in which I work, there's so many pieces of this book could be used to, you know, as, I don't like this language, but as exemplars, right? Or to sort of illustrate some of these concepts in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think, again, ultimately, for all of us, whether we're a marginalized person or otherwise, understanding how our story has brought us to this place, has helped us to cultivate this worldview is paramount. When we talk about people doing their own work, going on their own sort of journey, that's your journey. What's your story and how did it get you here? And how does that influence the way that you lived in this shared space, you move in and live in this shared space with others? And so, again, just a shameless plug for anybody who is an instructor or a teacher. You need to get up on this. And you know what I'm saying? Like, use this book to teach some of these life lessons for sure.
Absolutely. If I can co-sign on that one, I call it the bravery of being. In so many different ways, in a familiar sense, you showcase your father bravery of being by being an orphan and not allowing that to stop him. At one point being illiterate and not allowing that to stop him, being an immigrant and not allowing that to stop him. Like that bravery of being showcased and permeates through so many different levels of this. And it culminates in you being brave enough to tell this story of yourself, to say that there was a point where culturally, maybe I didn't understand the significance of my parents maintaining their language and culture because I was trying to assimilate. But then I got to a point where I did understand it. And now I'm doing things in memory, in reverence of what my parents had set out to do for us as a family. I'm living that now, for them. So this bravery of being is this beautiful current that goes throughout the entire thing that says, to do what I'm doing is exactly what I'm supposed to do, because I'm the one who can do this. Other people might not be able to, they may not be ready to, but I'm the one that can, and that's why I'm here to do it. That's why your father was out there taking those pictures that fateful night, and that was a game changer, right? Like, for experience, for all levels, like the bravery of being, that is, okay, I'm gonna stop.
Wow.
I'm just sit back there.
Love it. Love it.
Yeah, and if I can add to another thing I really enjoyed about the graphic novel as a whole is, and this is just me thinking about the importance of transparency and having these conversations with children, with young adults, but in a way where we don't talk down to them, that we show them that, you know, these are real lived experiences. This is the history. And I'm thinking more of the history of my people and how important that is for me, and interact with my own identity as well. And kind of like the shared experience too, in terms of language, in terms of intersectionality, and the way we negotiate that in the world. But I'm also thinking as well, different ways that, you know, we don't have to hide who we are or hide our culture, because that's a part of us. And, you know, there shouldn't be any shame on that too. And I'm thinking a lot about, you know, Puerto Ricans in the diaspora, for example, Puerto Ricans who were born in the US, and we're constantly told to choose one identifier. But again, they don't have to. You don't have to choose between your American side or your Latino side, for example. And again, just like on the island where you can be Black and Latino, you can be Asian and Latino, like there's no limit to how you can identify. And I see this graphic novel too as like a reflection of those shared experiences, and I thought it was very beautifully presented. So besides thanking you, Leela, for this creation, it was really meaningful for me in a lot of different facets.
Thank you so much.
What I really like about what you just said, Edsel, is I think we are seeing a turn to examining diversity within ourselves as well. I mean, this whole book is a person, right? And trying to say I am this at this time is a constraint I often see a lot of college students dealing with, right? And let's make it clear, college just costs a lot more than it used to. And so there are financial risks involved in quote unquote not knowing who you are. And so there's a lot of pressure on young people to quote unquote know who they are. And that just is the antithesis of creativity and lived creativity and lived authenticity. So I would never, I completely understand the economic struggle of someone trying to obtain a bachelor's degree in this country these days. At the same time, I do just try to find a space for them to let themselves be surprised by what they discover about themselves, and not have to have an answer to who are they, because that's going to keep, like this book, it's going to change. And being comfortable with that diversity within yourself is to me at least very valuable. And yep.
Yeah, I really resonate well with what you've all said, this idea of diversity in oneself, of intersectionality, of multiple stories, and feeling like one might be in spaces where, like I think as Edsel said, like feel like you have to be forced to choose, right, between different aspects of yourself when they're integrated as part of you. I really resonated with the story of Leela, your father, and being a minister, identifying as religious, but then being in a space where the way religion was being expressed was antithetical to his perspective. That one particular line, I apologize if I botch it, but it was something to the effect of they've like sort of ignored the gospel for the sake of their traditions. And as we said earlier, so many of these moments could feel like they're today. I am someone who identifies as religious, but I also identify as liberal. And in this country, those two aspects of my identity over the last 6 or 7 years have been very, very difficult to reconcile, to the point of, I think the one page you had where you said your father stopped going to any type of religious service and started going back to reading, like that resonated very strongly with my truth. And so I just, yeah, this idea of tension and how that is so contextual, I found very powerful.
And I think to connect that to what was said earlier, I think is you, Victor, about the bravery of being. Being is messy. It's complicated and complex. And I think sometimes, again, we have a lot of information out here, right? And information can sometimes be reduced to like, if you just do yoga and deep breathe, everything's going to be okay. Sometimes it's not. And sometimes because of your circumstances, it's definitely not. And I think that's another thing that is so valuable about this story, is that it shows that complexity, that sometimes pain that gets us to, you know, like, I think that sometimes we devalue those experiences, like, oh, we're just supposed to be happy and it's supposed to be so great. We're supposed to wake up and be perfectly fine with who we are. Yes, and sometimes that's not everybody's experiences. And so I think that one thing that I used to work with people in therapy with is about sort of being okay with that discomfort, being okay with that complexity, being okay with that, because that is part of the human experience. And so I think that bravery of being, as you mentioned, and even the tension that you're describing, Eric, between these different aspects of your identity, like, I would not necessarily want to devalue that, as it's part of the human experience. Doesn't mean it's pleasant. Doesn't mean I like it. It also is just as valuable as the stories in this book that are kind of dark, and again, the ones that were very uncomfortable for me to read because there's are just as important as the ones that are bright and light and positive. And I think that this was such a holistic existential work because of that. So again, thank you.
Wow.
You know what I found myself saying to people following up on it, Vanessa, recently is if you really, really feel, and this is the phenomenology of it, if you really feel like you know who you are, it might be the case that your world just hasn't changed that much, right? Because people whose worlds change a lot aren't afforded the opportunity to feel like they really know themselves. And so that sort of comfort, I'm not going to take anybody's religion away from them. I'm not going to steal anybody's security blanket. At the same time, you know, when people are looking out at other people and say, why are they struggling so much? Why are they so tight? Again, look to see what stays the same in your own world, and maybe you'll find that yours isn't changed as much as they do. And those are just things to look at things from a different perspective, turn the kaleidoscope a bit and see things kind of arranged in a different way to disrupt the perspective of comfortably knowing who you are. Okay, well, I think that about wraps up our conversation for this evening. What I want to do is, Etzel, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we're so glad you're here. And Leela, of course, thank you so much for creating this amazing book and for discussing it with us this evening.
It's been a lovely discussion. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And what I want to do now is share a little information. Oh, hold on here. Press the right button. Thank you very much. Join us for our next ReggieCon panel, where we celebrate LGBTQ plus History Month, Wednesday, October 19th, 7 p.m. Central Time, where we will have guest panelists, Mr. Ian Cooper, an MFA student from the Won-Suk Kim School of Fine Arts here at ISU, and then Ms. Faria Osman, a PhD candidate in our school psychology program in the Department of Psychology, where we're going to discuss this amazing graphic novel, The Magic Fish. So please make sure you can all attend that. We'd love to have you back. And thanks to all of the audience members who attended. Thanks to the people behind the scenes for making us look like we know what we're doing. Thanks again to our special guests, Etzel and Leela. Until next time, everyone have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.